treated. Roughly the same time, from the biblical records, we discover that there were dissidents. Again, they weren't called that. They weren't called intellectuals. They were called prophets. That's a bad translation of a very obscure Hebrew word. Nobody knows what it means. But they were called prophets. But if you look back if you read the Bible, what they were was what we would call dissident intellectuals. They were carrying out geopolitical analysis, warning that the kings were, carrying out actions like alienating the Assyrians and so on, which were going to cause disaster. They were calling for mercy and justice to widows and orphans. They were condemning the crimes of the evil king and so on. Were they treated nicely? Well, go back to the Bible and take a look. They were called haters of Israel. That's the origin of the phrase self-hating Jew, which you hear all the time. It extends to anti-American, meaning critics of your own country. And they were driven into the desert, imprisoned, not treated nicely at all. There were intellectuals who were treated very well and honored. They were also called prophets. Centuries later, they were called false prophets. But they were the flatterers at the court, and they were doing fine. And that's the way it works. Flatterers at the court are honored and respected. The critics are punished one way or another. How they're punished depends on the society, but always treated badly in one way or another. It can be, at the extreme, it can be like the assassinated Jesuits. Lesser punishment could be, say, Havel and Sakharov, and similarly all the way back. This is a very persistent theme in history. You can think it through and see if you can find counterexamples. Actually, there are a few counterexamples, and they're very striking. So today, in today's world, the only really significant counterexamples that I know of, at least, are in Turkey. In Turkey, leading intellectuals, the prominent writers, the most prominent writers, academics, journalists, publishers, and artists, not only are protesting constantly the crimes of the Turkish state, which are pretty serious, not only protesting those crimes, but constantly participating in civil disobedience against them, which means facing, sometimes enduring, really severe punishment, like long jail sentences. I don't know of any other country like this. And I have to say, when I come to Europe, I always have to smile a little when I hear that the Turks are not civilized enough to be allowed into the august European Union. I mean, maybe, but from another point of view, it looks a little bit different. But that's the only major exception that I know today. So there are exceptions, undoubtedly. Well, that's one interpretation of the responsibility of intellectuals. What's the general task that they fulfill, the factual side? There's also the value issue. There you have to, factual side, you can study the facts and draw pretty conclusions with fair confidence. When you turn to the values, of course, you're asking what your own moral values are. And I think there are a number of pretty simple ideas that ought to define what the role of intellectuals ought to be. By intellectuals, I just mean people of relative privilege, training, resources, opportunity, an ability to be in a position where you can get involved in some fashion in affairs that matter to human beings. So it's intellectuals. It excludes, for example, a great scientist who just stays in his laboratory and wins his Nobel Prize. It excludes somebody who's working so hard putting food on the table that he just doesn't have time to think about these things. But it includes, in our societies like ours, a large group of other people, for example, anybody related to a university anyhow, because we have these privileges and opportunities. So that's roughly the category. One principle that you'd think would be obvious is that we apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, or maybe harsher ones, more stringent ones, but at least the same ones. So if terror is bad when they do it to us, then terror is bad when we do it to them, maybe 10 times as much. And that's, again, to take a historical example, if anyone were to follow this principle, take, say, 9/11, the great modern event that changed the world, transformed the world. It was a terrible atrocity, undoubtedly. Could have been a lot worse. Very much like Havel's punishment, could have been worse. So suppose on 9/11 that Al-Qaeda had, say, bombed the White House, killed the president, installed a military dictatorship, murdered thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands of people, established an international terror center in Washington, which started overthrowing governments in other countries and installing comparable dictatorships, carrying out assassinations abroad and so on. Brought in a group of economists, maybe call them the Kandahar boys, who quickly tanked the economy, drove it into the worst depression it had been in maybe in its entire history. Okay, that would have been worse. It happened on 9/11. It happened on 9/11, 1973. It's the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile and the installation of the Pinochet dictatorship. Well, it was a lot worse than, in fact, in Latin America, they often call it the first 9/11. It was incomparably worse than what we call 9/11 by any dimension you can think of. But that one, and it certainly changed the world. It was instrumental in causing the rash of dictatorships that spread over Latin America and much else. Not to speak of what it did to the people of Chile, but that's not in history. If we were to accept the elementary principle that usual defect, wrong agency, U.S. was behind it. If we were to accept the principle that we apply to ourselves the same standards we do to others, that's the way we'd be discussing and teaching and thinking about the atrocities of 9/11. Well, needless to say, it's not, though it is in parts of South America. The victims tend to have a somewhat more realistic view of the world than the ones who hold the clubs. So one principle is at least apply to yourselves the same standards you do to apply to others. That sounds simple, but almost never observed. Another is to set priorities. We all have finite energy and time, can't do everything. So try to focus on the things that are important. What are importance, of course, is another value judgment. So what's important? Well, one criterion for importance is things that you can influence. So if there's something going on somewhere where you can have an influence, well, that's important to focus on. It may be nice to criticize the crimes of Genghis Khan, but you can't do much about it. And the same is true of crimes carried out by somebody else. You can say how awful it is, but nothing much you can do. On the other hand, crimes in which you're involved yourselves, you can do quite a lot. The closer you are to agency, the more you can do. So that should be the focus. Well, I won't run through examples. I leave it as an exercise. But you'll find that exactly the opposite is done. Exactly the opposite. In fact, you can pretty well determine what the role of intellectuals ought to be by taking a look at what is going on and just turning it to the opposite. It turns out to be a pretty successful technique of analysis. So that's another thing you can do. Other things you can do are to participate in changing your own surroundings, as much of the society as you can reach, in such ways that these values will be accepted. whether it's by teaching, by organizing, by activism, many other ways. I just end by citing an injunction which often is used to formulate these principles, which I think merits some critical attention. It's a precept used by people who personally are close friends and who I respect and honor a lot, Quaker activists, Quaker human rights, anti-war activists, very courageous people, also involved in civil disobedience, protests, they're very dedicated, picking the right principles. Their precept is that they should be telling truth to power. And I think that's the one thing I really disagree with them on. I don't think that the role of people with some degree of privilege, say like us, should be to tell truth to power. One reason is power already knows the truth. You don't have to tell it to them. They understand it very well. That's why they're doing what they're doing. Another is that they're not the right audience. You should be reaching people who don't know the truth. Tell them. Furthermore, you shouldn't be telling them. It's not that we have some, I, you, whoever it is, has some kind of magic authority. We have our own ideas. They have their ideas. In 1975, for example, the large majority of Americans, I think, knew the truth, that the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. You don't have to tell them the truth. You can participate with them in finding out the truth, learning it yourself, encouraging them to think it through for themselves. So you should be reaching out to other people, trying to learn the truth as best you can together with them, and it should be the audience that matters, and not the powerful, and it should be on issues that are of significance. So I think a somewhat more complex version of that precept ought to be adopted. But the intuition behind it is right, and I think it's a sensible guide. And from that we can kind of work out what the responsibility of intellectuals ought to be, comparing it with what the function actually is, and drawing appropriate conclusions. I'll stop there.